Hi. So I'm thinking of taking a little bit of a break from my reconsidered series of videos and making a short series of videos intended as a general introduction to the philosophy of existentialism. And this video will be the first one in that series. In this video, I'll be focusing on how people commonly perceive existentialism, especially with respect to exploring how those perceptions are accurate and how they're not. Then, in the second video in the series, I'll focus on the principal themes of existential thought. And in the third video, I'll sketch out its historical emergence and trajectory, as well as its primary thinkers and texts. However, discussing existentialism in this very general introductory way already presents us with a number of difficulties. That's first because existentialism encompasses a fairly broad and disparate range of thinkers and ideas, which makes articulating general truths about its nature somewhat challenging. Second, that challenge is only compounded by the fact that some thinkers who are commonly regarded as existentialists don't necessarily embrace the term or agree with that characterization. However, probably the most compelling reason why it's difficult to articulate general truths about existentialism has to do with the nature of existence itself, with the contrary and elusive character of life as we know it, in all of its seething complexity, its stupefying grandeur and horror, ceaselessly unfolding in the roiling welter of its paradoxical and fugitive logic. And well, the thing about life is that it's hard to reduce all of that to some easy sequence of formulae or propositions, or even to say what the hell it is we're really experiencing in the first place. Basically, existentialism is hard to define, mostly because life itself is hard to define. So, in light of all of that, I'd like to begin this series of videos not by giving you some rigid, simplistic definition of existentialism, but by examining how people commonly perceive it. For instance, imagine doing an informal survey, let's say at your local Walmart, where you went around asking a whole bunch of semi-random people the following question. Excuse me, sir. Would you mind telling me how you conceptualize the fundamental nature of existential thought? Personally, I bet that the most common answer you'd get would go something like this. I guess that existentialism is a school of philosophical thought that focuses primarily on the nature of existence, which it views primarily in individualistic, atheistic, and somewhat dark and depressive terms. Okay, so let's unpack this. First, is existentialism actually a school of philosophical thought? The answer is, well, yes and no. It is a school of philosophical thought insofar as people usually regard it as being part and parcel of the larger discipline of philosophy, especially since it's often taught in philosophy courses at universities. And certainly some existential texts, especially of the type known as existential phenomenology, do seem very technically philosophical in nature. For instance, if you pick up Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, it's obvious from the very first page that this is definitely a philosophy book. It's dense, highly technical, and makes numerous references to other thinkers and texts within the historical canon of Western philosophy. However, in other regards, existentialism doesn't seem much like philosophy, at least not philosophy in the usual sense of the word. For instance, if you open up Albert Camus' The Stranger, in the first few pages you read about how the main character's mother died recently, although he can't remember the exact day. Then, about 100 pages later, you're still slogging through a narrative filled with all the rather sordid details of that character's life in Algeria. And at that point, you can well wonder, where's the philosophy here? And that's actually true of a fair number of existential works. They often don't seem traditionally philosophical, at least not on the surface. That's because existentialism, especially in its more literary forms, is doing something very different from what Western philosophy typically does. For instance, Existentialism hardly ever operates by first proposing a set of defensible axiomatic suppositions, and then articulating a method, and then applying that method to the axioms to generate a set of necessary conclusions. In other words, existentialism hardly ever uses conventional philosophical argumentation to convince us that its insights are intellectually defensible and hence convincing. In fact, it would be fair to say that existentialism doesn't actually operate by trying to convince us at all. Instead, it operates by showing us things, by inviting us to glimpse the subtleties and latencies of our lives that we typically don't notice. In other words, its project is simply to help us awaken to the reality we're inhabiting, to engender a particular kind of sensitivity and sensibility in us with respect to the actuality of our existence. Or, to put it another way, its goal is more like that of music or poetry, to evoke rather than to argue or inform. Of course, existentialists don't renounce argumentative reason or its obvious fruits in principle. What they renounce is the excessive preoccupation with reason at the expense of the larger terrain of life, which would include the broad panoply of human passions. And for some people, this is what makes existentialism a particularly suspect and objectionable endeavor, mostly because it refuses to worship slavishly at the temple of rigid logical coherence, as many of our social conventions and personal predilections would seemingly require. For existentialists, as for many clinical psychologists, part of the problem with cleaving too compulsively to rationality is that being exposed to logically correct argumentation hardly ever changes anyone in any genuinely important, non-trivial way. At the level where we live and breathe, for instance. Sure, that kind of discourse can prompt us to regard some assertions as more defensible or more demonstrably correct than others are. And yes, all of that has its necessary time and place within the larger ambit of human affairs. But it would be a mistake to think that we change our fundamental posture toward life mostly because someone has managed to win an intellectual debate or succeeded in ramrodding a logically correct conclusion down our throats. For most of us, all of that kind of activity is, well, eminently forgettable. Contrary to popular wisdom, it doesn't matter all that much within the larger run of life, at least not for most of us. That's because what actually matters in this world plays out much more often along the more intimate dimensions of our humanity. In the warm glow of our enduring friendships, for instance, or in the whispers and intimations of our hidden desires and passions, or perhaps in something as simple as the sweet familiar fragrance borne upon the autumn wind, as twilight's long shadows creep furtively toward frozen winter. And so, for the most part, existentialists tend to speak in that kind of language, in the secret language of life itself, in the relatively indirect language of evocative stories, novels, poems, sarcasm, jokes, paradoxical epigrams, and riddles. And isn't it true that that sort of language is what tends to call us beyond ourselves and into the larger plenum of life, much more reliably than logical argumentation does? And isn't it equally true to say that for the most part we live according to our desires rather than according to the dictates of our rationality? In fact, I'd say that the most common role of reason in people's lives is to construct persuasive pretexts and/or post-factum justifications for what people want to do anyhow. And in the ethical sphere, well, for the most part, we do what we want to do, not what we ought to do. And I don't think that you have to look too hard at the political arena, or any other major arena, to find a confirmation of that. Consequently, the kind of understanding that possesses the power to speak to the larger totality of our lives isn't particularly centered around rationality or logic. It is, as Soren Kierkegaard once put it, primarily a matter of subjective truth. The kinds of realizations that we have to experience firsthand for them to count as valid at all. So, in this regard, one could easily regard existentialism as more of an art, more like literature or music than philosophy. So, to return to the original question, is existentialism a type of philosophy? Well, turns out that the answer is yes and no. But what about individualism, which we mentioned at the beginning of this video? Is existentialism necessarily individualistic, as people often suppose? Well, here again, the answer is yes and no. Certainly there's a pronounced streak of individualism that runs through existential thinking. For instance, Kierkegaard's and Sartre's work often embodies that sort of animating spirit. However, it's also fairly easy to find thinkers who affirm and valorize life's interpersonal and social dimensions. For instance, for Martin Buber, all real living unfolds when we manage to say thou to one another, when we encounter and meet each other in a deep and mutual I-thou relationship. Similarly, for Martin Heidegger, every moment of our lives is a composite of the world of sociality, which he calls the Mitwelt, along with the personal and natural world aspects of human existence, which he calls the Eigenwelt and Umwelt, respectively. For Heidegger, all three of those dimensions are constantly interweaving and influencing one another. So, is existentialism individualistic? The overall answer is yes and no, because the emphasis on individualism varies a lot from thinker to thinker. And the same is true with respect to the question of whether existentialism is necessarily atheistic. Probably the thinker who was most responsible for making existentialism seem atheistic would be Sartre, who explicitly saw atheism as a necessary aspect of his vision of existential phenomenology. That's because for Sartre, existence precedes essence. In other words, we experience human existence first, and only on the basis of our experience do we then try to make sense of life, either by positing the existence of an all-powerful deity, or alternatively, by construing our experience in terms of scientific principles, or by any other conceivable stratagem. After all, believing in God and observing phenomena in a scientific laboratory are themselves nothing more than particular kinds of experience. So, no matter how you slice it, our experience of existence comes first, and only then do we get the paradoxical idea that something else must necessarily have greater primacy than that. So, for Sartre, if we really want to ask about the nature of our existence in a fundamental way, we need to be willing to suspend relatively derivative constructs like God and scientific principles and attend directly to what our experience of life is actually showing us. And of course, this sort of thinking can make existentialism seem pretty atheistic, or at least agnostic. But on the other hand, to locate an existential thinker who is every bit as ardently theistic, one need look no further than the grandfather of modern existentialism, the Christian existentialist, Soren Kierkegaard. Or, in more recent times, to the Judaic existential theologian Martin Buber. So to sum it up, for some thinkers, it's impossible to do existentialism with God, and for others, it's impossible to do it without God. So, is existentialism atheistic? Yes and no. And finally, as we noted in our initial characterization at the beginning of this video, existentialism has a reputation as a particularly dark and depressive mode of thinking. But is it really? Once again, the answer is yes and no. I would say that part of what makes existentialism seem dark is that existentialists are definitely not shy about exploring life's more difficult, more painful sensations and experiences. For instance, they're pretty quick to write at length about things like anxiety, alienation, dread, impossible desires, angst, mindless conformity, midnights of the soul, etc. And if that's not enough, they also tend to spend a lot of time exploring the meaning of mortality and death. However, on the other side of the scale, one might well ask what a truly depressive worldview actually is. For instance, which is really more depressing? A worldview that's willing to name and explore all that's difficult and painful in human existence? Or one that steadfastly avoids talking about all of that? One that insists that everyone must think and say only nice, happy, inoffensive things all the time. Happy, 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 happy. You must be happy. Happy. God, after a while, it makes you want to go on a 3-state killing spree. So, if you're looking for a truly depressive, hellish worldview, I would say don't look to existentialism. Look to the worldview where we're not allowed to express our inner darkness. A world of ceaseless charade, of bland and unremitting denial, where giving voice to our gnawing anxieties, our hatred and unreasonable animosities, and our alienation from each other and ourselves is commonly deemed inappropriate and offensive. As psychoanalytic thinkers have also realized, we're most thoroughly ruled by what we try hardest to repress, both in ourselves and in the world. So, is existentialism dark and depressive? Again, it's yes and no. And moreover, a lot of it depends upon your own personal contact with existentialism, as well as your own personal contact with life more generally. As for me, well, I like existentialism. No, it's not the final answer to life's riddle, but it's definitely a provocative and worthwhile perspective. But hey, that's just me. As in all things, your results may vary. Not valid in all states of being. Anyhow, if you're interested in hearing more about my own personal contact with existentialism and why I like it, you can see my video entitled Why I Like Existentialism. I'll try to remember to put a link to it in the description for this video. Okay, thanks for watching. Peace out.